Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Mourne Memories of Places Past series of talks that we're doing. This is the third in the series, so thanks everybody for joining us. Tonight we've got Eoin Halpin. He's going to be talking about saints and scholars. So before I hand over to Eoin, just a couple of quick housekeeping. Everybody's on mute at the minute when they joined, so I'd appreciate if you could keep it that way, maybe until the end. Just so there's no interruption with multiple people speaking. If you want to ask a question, feel free to put it into the chat window, and we should have a wee bit of time at the end to ask any questions that are gathered up there. And at the end, we'll also, anybody that wants to unmute themselves and ask Eoin directly can do that. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Eoin to get us started.
Okay. There we are. We can see that, Aidan, can we? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted again to be here. For those of you who weren't here from yesterday's talk, you missed a cracker. But hopefully tonight's will be something similar. I've decided that this evening what we talk about is sort of saints and scholars, and the reason for that is that the talk really is based around the Maghera area of the locality, centering on the monastic site at Maghera, but ultimately dealing with the wider archaeological landscape and I suppose Maghera's place in that landscape and how it all fits in together. And we'll have a look at the archaeology of the Maghera area from the Mesolithic right through to the early Christian period and beyond. I've stalled. Hang on now. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So as always, I like to give a bit of context. And again, if you're listening to my talk last night, we talked quite a bit about ice and the role that ice had to play in Ireland before man ever arrived on the island. And the slide here on the left-hand side shows the very dark outline is the extent of the ice at its greatest. And you can see very clearly from that map that at that stage, and this is about 300,000 years ago, all of Ireland was covered in ice. But you'll note that the south of Britain wasn't. And so this area of Britain was occupied at the time, 300,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, but Ireland wasn't. And it was really only until the ice started to retreat and we got into an interglacial period for about 8,000 years. But then, as always happens in these situations, the ice started to re-advance again. But ultimately, the main body of ice really left Ireland free, in inverted commas, probably from about 12,000 years ago. And as we discussed last night, a lot of that ice obviously contained water, and that meant that the sea levels were considerably lower in the post-glacial period at around 15,000 years ago, between 10 and 15,000 years ago. But nonetheless, the current thinking is that there was Ireland was an island at that stage. And the map on the right is quite interesting if you have a study of it. Obviously, the darker line shows the outline of the coast as we know it and love it today. We're just here with Strangford Lough. But the lighter green is the suggested coastline in that period between 15,000 and about 10,000 years ago. The most interesting thing is note how much of the area around Liverpool and the Isle of Man was completely green. So you could have walked from the Cumbrian coast, from Sellafield, straight out to the Isle of Man, which would have basically been a mountain in those days. And you could have very easily looked across the channel to the Mourne Mountains. So the ground from the Isle of Man across to the Mournes was really basically, it's if you look at it today, it's the same as from Rathlin across to Mull, would be in the same distance. It's literally touching distance. But it is very important to remember that even at that stage, Ireland was an island. And therefore, the consequence of that was that the first people who arrived in Ireland had to have arrived by sea. They didn't arrive on land. So this is the lower picture, which is a really interesting picture, is the picture currently. That's taken a view from the Isle of Man, looking across to the Mournes. And it's interesting, even at that stage, how prominent Donard was on the landscape, or is on the landscape, and how much more important, or much more obvious it would have been had the distance, in other words, had the channel between the two areas been a lot less. So quite clearly, if, again, up in the top left-hand corner, if you're living in and around the landscape of the Isle of Man, you're looking across to Donard, which would have been a matter of maybe a couple of miles across open water, albeit probably relatively treacherous. So the bottom line is that 8,000 years ago, man arrived on the island of Ireland. But the question is, where did he come from? And currently there are 3 different potential routes into the country. One is from Scotland across into Antrim. The other is from Wales across into the south. And then the one that people reckon is probably the original one is the route from Britain across what was the Isle, the bay, the Isle of the bay, the Dryshod Bay now, where the Isle of Man is, and then across from the Isle of Man into Ireland. However, it's not that straightforward. You would expect that the Mesolithic material that you find on the west coast of Britain would be very similar to the Mesolithic material, the tools, the stone tools you find on the east coast of Ireland. But that's not true. That's not true. There are quite considerable differences between the material that you find in Ireland and the material you find in both Scotland, the Isle of Man, and Wales. And that raises the question, which archaeologists are still worried about, as to what precise mechanism for the trip from the east coast or the west coast of Britain across to the east coast of Ireland. Those of you who are interested in maps will note that there's a very interesting line coming up from out of nowhere, coming up into the south of Ireland. That is because in the south of Ireland, we're getting some Mesolithic material that's very similar to material found in Brittany, in the northwest coast of France. And that's also interesting, because that presupposes that not only could they travel across a relatively narrow stretch of water between Ireland and England, but they could also carry out quite long distances, as much as from the coast of Brittany. So what was Mesolithic man? What environment did they have? Well, effectively, they were hunter-gatherers, and the entire population of the country would certainly have been between 3,000 and 5,000 people, very, very lightly populated. They lived seasonally, moving around from place to place, following food resources. The major archaeological site that has been excavated in Ireland is just outside Coleraine in a place called Mount Sandal, and if you look at the graphic on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see that these people building a circular hut out of branches some 5 meters in diameter, tied together at the top. And when they excavated Mount Sandal, they found evidence for those post holes. So that's what they reckon. So it would have been covered in skin, maybe sod, but probably only available for the season. A bit like the Indians in America, moving from place to place. In America, obviously, they're following the likes of the buffalo. In Ireland, they were probably moving up and down rivers, following winter salmon or summer salmon, and then moving down to the coast later on in the year. The right-hand side of the screen is basically the sort of tools and equipment, the evidence for Mesolithic man that we find. We very rarely find anything else other than stone tools, because of the nature of the archaeology. But after about, so Mesolithic man arrived about 8,000 years ago, but about 6,000 years ago, there was a huge developmental change in the country. And we moved from a Mesolithic, which was a hunter-gatherer community, to an agricultural community. So rather than being mobile, we became sedentary. And we started to develop I won't say towns, but certainly communities of properly well-built houses. You can see here that agriculture started in Mesopotamia, which is the cradle of civilization, down in the Tigris and the Euphrates River in the Near East. And you can see these waves of development moving from 9,500 years ago, moving across Europe. These lines indicate the earliest agriculture in the various parts of Europe as they travel across, reaching Ireland 6,000 years ago. So not only did they have a different diet, because they were farmers, so they would have had domesticated animals, they would have had cattle, they would have had sheep, they would have had goats, they would have had pigs, but they also had wheat. So they domesticated grasses, and which allowed them to be sedentary. Rather than moving to find their food, the food came to them in terms of they were basically farmers. But the major difference, of course, as we well know, was that the material culture. So not only did they have a different set of stone tools, but they also had pottery for the first time. Mesolithic man didn't have pottery. They simply, presumably, would have used wooden vessels, but for the first time, they had pottery vessels. And the other important thing to remember, or to get into your heads, is that this was a movement of people as well as ideas. So Mesolithic man, all 5,000 or 6,000 of them, or whatever it was, by the time Neolithic man arrived, they were a different set of people. They were different people, so it wasn't just an idea of agriculture. It was actually people, different sorts of people, and it was an invasion, if you like, rather than an exchange of ideas. And one of the major features we have in the Neolithic is a different set of burial practices. So in the Mesolithic, what little evidence we have is that they buried people, they cremated bones and put the bones in relatively unmarked graves. But suddenly we have the arrival in the Neolithic of massive tomb building. And interestingly enough, that movement of agriculture across the country, you can trace burial practices across Europe at the same rate. And by the time it gets to Ireland, we have these three classic Neolithic burial monuments. You have portal tombs, top left-hand corner, Slithery Ford, or Water-esque as it's known as well. You have Audley's Town, which is a court tomb, and on top of Donard, we have a major passage tomb, albeit very denuded. The stones have been stripped away, but if you look at the cursor on the bottom left-hand corner, I'll trace the actual size of the monument. It's a much bigger monument than people may realize when they go up to the top of Donard, because they see the obvious pile of stones. But the monument itself is actually some 30 meters in diameter, and it would have had a passage with a central chamber. Now the image I'm showing you in the bottom right hand corner, that is the passage up on top of Slieve Gullion. But they would have been the same sort of monument, and there's evidence that there was a passage and there was a chamber in the Great Cairn on top of Donard. And people were, again, there was by and large with the portal tombs, passage tombs, and court tombs, there was a mixture of cremated bones and inhumations. In other words, bodies were placed in these monuments. So the reconstruction, if you like, in the top left-hand corner is what a landscape in the Neolithic would have looked like. And remember the picture I showed you of the Mesolithic. Suddenly now we're getting groups of fairly well substantial rectangular houses constructed from very large timbers. These houses would have been of the order of maybe 15, 20 meters long and 5 meters wide. The other thing to note is that we're dividing up the fields. Now the landscape is being cleared and the fields are being divided. All of this we have evidence for in other parts of Ireland, and massive, as you say, tomb building going on. And again, top right, you have the stone axes and the pottery associated with the megalithic cultures. And then you have, following on that, so from about 2500 to 500 BC, so that's about 4.5 to 2,500 years ago, we have the introduction of metal. And I always think it must have been absolutely mind-boggling for a people who had only ever known stone and chipping away at flint and using polished stone axes, albeit absolutely beautiful objects, to have somebody turn up with a lump of rock, stone, heat up that stone and create something new, a metal object. And to be able to create objects like spearheads and axes and swords, to a people who only ever knew stone, that I hasten to say it's probably worse than, well, it's probably better or more mind-boggling than somebody discovering the power of the computer for the first time, who's only ever known books or something. It's very difficult to get a comparison between these guys, who must have been absolutely magical. They really must have been magic wizards almost, these people who turned up who could make different objects. And you've got to remember, in its raw ore state, you know, bronze and copper and tin were stones, and then they mixed the copper and tin together to make the bronze. But notice the landscape down in the bottom right-hand corner now of the various monuments that we associate with the Bronze Age. We get massive stone circles, like of which there are many around the country, and we get these henge monuments now. We get big ditches with stone circles in the middle of them, and the burial practices are now barrows. They're not stone monuments again. So an entirely different set of ritual monuments. And then we move from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And to me, again, this smacks of a major advance, if you like, because quite clearly anybody who was using bronze and gold and precious metals in the in the Bronze Age, were suddenly confronted by these much more durable, much more hard-wearing iron objects, swords and axes and the like. And interestingly enough, it is from the Iron Age that most of the Irish mythologies come from. Cuchulainn and the Fianna and these massive warriors that are hailed and recorded in the Táin, and all of these Irish epics. These are all Iron Age people, and they must have been seen to have been absolutely supermen, because one of these swords would have gone straight through any bronze armor that anybody might have had. So these guys would have been veritable supermen of the Iron Age. And then we have the arrival of Christianity, as we well know, around this part of the world, famous for its association with St. Patrick in 432. And the arrival of Christianity is an interesting one, because as I was talking last evening, the Irish Church very quickly realized that in order to be successful, rather than stamp on local traditions, they embraced local traditions, and they embraced local gods of the late Iron Age, and Christianized them. Most famously, Brigoid was a famous Iron Age deity, and that became Saint Bridget, and there are many more. So we have a development of monastic enclosures. We have churches. We have high crosses. But from our point of view, at the in this part of the world, because of the quantity of them, I mean, we have raths or ring forts or fairy forts, as they're variously known. These monuments were basically farmsteads. They're defined by a circular enclosure, banked, probably with the palisade on top of them, and inside which families would have lived, extended families, 2 or 3 houses inside the enclosure. And at night, the animals would have been brought into the enclosure, and then they would have been let out during the day. They are by far the most prolific monuments in the Irish countryside. There's over 45,000 of them in Ireland. And again, bottom right-hand corner, if you're reading that, you know, any place name beginning with Rath or Lish or Cahill or Cahir or Doon are all derived from the fact that there are one of these monuments in the locality. So Rathmullen, Lismore, Cashel, Cahir, you know, Dun, you can name them. They're all over the place. And indeed, well, as I say there, the name County Down could also be, but Dun can also be a mound. And they also, interestingly enough, they also can be very simple monuments, circular monuments like you see there in the top right-hand corner, but they can be hugely impressive, as the monument in Lisnagade, just outside Lisburn. And it has 3 banks and ditches around the outside. And not only that, but it has a secondary rath beside it. I always equate these sort of monuments, Lisnagade, with the local farmer who puts Romanesque porticos on the front of his house and puts massive gates on the front of his thing with big eagles, and has a big long drive leading up to his house. It's the same sort of thing. They were basically showing off. These guys they had money, they had power, and they wanted to show the locals how powerful they were. And so they created a bigger rath than the next door neighbor. And then the sort of early Christian period ends with the arrival of the AngloNormans. And I always think that it is absolutely unbelievable that the AngloNormans arrived in Wexford in 1169 with Strongbow and his mates. And a mere whatever that is, what is it, 9 years later, 69, 70, 8 years later, these guys were building Carrickfergus Castle, having taken over all of the east coast of Ireland. And I say there shock and awe, but it must have been shock and awe, because they had, I think it was 60 knights on horseback, plus maybe 100 foot soldiers, and that force effectively took over all of Ireland from Wexford up to Carrickfergus and beyond, and building monuments as they went. And one of the more famous monuments that they built was the Mound of Down, which I believe is originally the outside of the Mound of Down was probably a chieftain's rath, a very major early Christian rath, which the AngloNormans took over and built a motte in the middle of it. And that's what they did. They found out who the biggest buck was in the locality, and they basically went and they took him down, or her down, and supplanted that, put their mark on the local chieftain's area, the territory. And it happened classically again in Dundrum, taking over what probably was a pre-existing early Christian site, and sticking a substantial fortification, Dundrum Castle, built by this guy John de Courcy, who's one of the knights that came over with Strongbow. But also we have the Motte and Bailey in Clough. And the Motte and Bailey basically is a precursor to a castle. So you have a motte, which you put a defended enclosure on top of it, and then you have a bailey, which is where you lived, and then in times of trouble you moved back up to the motte, and the motte and the bailey are divided by a substantial ditch. And then later on we have the arrival of the more domestic castles, of which we have in the locality some very nice examples. We have Narrow Water, built in the 1560s. We have Audley's Castle, which is famous for those people who watch whatever that program was on television. I can't remember the name of it now. God, that's dreadful. Oh, Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones. Anyone who's interested in Game of Thrones, Audley's Town Castle appeared as in it, and then Bagnall's Castle in Newry. So let's get back to Maghera itself then. And as always, in context, Maghera sits in a glacial valley, surrounded by higher ground on gently rising higher ground on both sides. You have it's nestles down, looking out into the Irish Sea and Dundrum Bay. But as you can see on the lower graphic, it's nestled in that valley, which was ultimately created by the ice that we talked about earlier on. A large ice sheet came round the side of Slieve Croob and then ducked down the coast out into the Irish Sea, creating the valley that we now know where Maghera sits and Dundrum Bay. But this graphic is quite interesting because it shows glacial till, which is quite heavy and quite difficult to work in much of the area, but there's a finger of much lighter raised beach sands and gravels, better drainage, lighter soils generally, and that is where the sort of Maghera and the ecclesiastical centre of Maghera sort of developed. Quite an interesting feature from a local point of view, that it's possible that one of the main reasons why the Maghera monastic enclosure developed where it did was because of the fact that there was it was in a valley fed by a nice stream and with good, easily worked soils. But maybe more about that later. So this is a graphic showing the various density of archaeological monuments in the Maghera area. The blue sites are prehistoric, and all of the ones that are dotted along the sand hills here are stray finds of either Mesolithic or Neolithic archaeology found in the sand dunes along the coast. But we have standing stones, we have Neolithic mounds, and we have, as you may know, two very nice examples of Neolithic monuments. We have the portal. We have the portal tomb of Slithery Ford, as we say, or Wateresque, and we have the Ballyloughlin megalith, which, although it's a standing stone, currently it's beside the road, and it's believed that it might be the last remnants of a much larger archaeological monument, possibly something like either another portal tomb or a court tomb. And the sort of material that we're getting, the sandhills, we're getting this sandhills ware, which is this very distinctive Neolithic type pottery, highly decorated, and that's the sandhills. That's where the name comes from. It's made its way into the archaeological typologies as a particular type. And then we have Ballykeel, which with these beautiful carinated bowls were found in the Ballykeel Dolmen. That's in County Armagh, but it just shows you the quality of the archaeological finds that you get from the portal tombs. So in the early medieval period, which are the lighter green dots that are scattered around the area, the letter E stands for enclosure, and that's simply archaeological speak for we're not sure what it is. It's probably a rath or a ring fort, but because we can't be absolutely sure, on the archaeological record it appears as an enclosure. But having surveyed most of these monuments in my day, 90% of them are early Christian raths, and it just shows you the numbers of raths that we have in a small area around Maghera. Where there's an S beside it, that means there's a souterrain. So we have a rath and a souterrain there. We have a souterrain and a possible rath up here. We have a cashel and a souterrain. A cashel, by the way, is so if a circular fort is made of earth, it's called a rath. If it's made of stone, it's called a cashel. But they're effectively the same monument dating from the same period. And they are defined by where they're cashels, they are defined by substantial stone walls, creating a ring and with normally at one entrance. But you can get say raths and cashels appearing in the same place. It's literally, if the area is predominantly stone and stony ground, you tend to get cashels. If it's fairly well easily dug, you tend to get raths made of earth, and that's what the top left-hand corner picture shows. And so we're into monasticism, of which Maghera and the core area of Maghera is possibly most famous for. But we also, interestingly enough, have a mass rock. We have a bull-on stone. A bull-on stone is a stone that has a hollow sculpted into its surface, which water collects, and that water is deemed to be blessed and holy. And they are classically found in the environs of monastic sites. If you're looking for a checklist of a monastic site, looking for a monastic site, you look for a church, you look for crosses, you look for a round tower, you look for bull-on stones, you look for a graveyard. And it is, in fact, that bull-on stone, if I remember correctly, somebody might correct me on this, but I think that bull-on stone might actually not be in situ. In other words, might not be in its original setting, and it may originally have come from the Maghera area. the monastic site. So this is the what I suppose to a certain extent what the Maghera site's most famous for, because it was founded by Saint Doungart or Doungart, but ultimately Donard, Saint Donard, in the 6th century. And not very much is known about him, except that he came from a royal family, royal lineage. He's referenced in the annals, and interestingly enough, just to tie in with the prehistory, he pilgrimaged or made a pilgrimage to the top of Donard, and he created the folklore, the myth, or whatever the story of the holiness of the top of Donard, and Christianized the Great Cairn, with the chamber, I believe, being reused as a holy well. The other, of course, the famous site or the famous element of the Maghera site is the round tower, which, as you can see there, was originally something in the order of between 25 and 30 meters tall when it was in all its glory. And that's some height, 30 meters high. And there's a great story that when it fell down in the wind in 1711 or 1710, 1711, it fell down in one big cigar shape. So it cracked along the line that you can see there, but the entire top, the entire 20 meters, fell as one big tube onto the ground beside it. And they remarked in the 18th century that it was testament to the quality of the build that the entire thing could fall down and stay in one piece, so to speak. Interestingly enough, I have no idea what would have happened to it. Presumably it was broken up and reused on field walls and whatever. But it would have been a fascinating site had it still been survived to this day. They're known as clockchocks, which is basically a bell house, and I believe that that's probably what their function was. That the monks were called to prayer from a tolling bell that would have been rung from the top of the bell tower. And again, no more than in the early Christian period, when you had a rath with multiple ditches. I think that the abbots who owned these or who ran these monastic enclosures, the bigger the bell tower, the bigger the abbot. You know, I think that's all it was. There are 70 known round towers in Ireland. An interesting 4 of them are in County Down. We have one here in Maghera, we have one in Dundrum, Drumbo, and we have reference to one in Downpatrick, although we still haven't found the remains of that, despite the time team's best efforts. He says, but we have, interestingly enough, in Maghera, we have an enclosure which they believed possibly to be a cashel site, inside which the 13th century church was built, and inside which has been used as a graveyard. So it's interesting that it is possible that the original enclosure around Maghera Church might actually have been a pre-existing cashel. But perhaps Maghera is maybe, apart from its round tower, is best known for its early medieval cross slabs. And this is an illustration from Hamlin's book, Anne Hamlin's book, her magnum opus on the cross slabs of Northern Ireland. Fantastic volume. Again, I can put the reference up for people who might be interested. But you can see the sort of quality and the variety of cross slabs that we got right across. There's 7 known, and there's one that Anne Hamlin, I think, could never find. But these are still exist, and they're still to be seen today in the graveyard of the monastery, or the enclosure. Interesting enough, Anne Hamlin carried out an excavation in 1965, and you can see in the top left-hand drawing, where she put in 3 cuttings, 2 of them around the round tower. You can see 2 of them. This is the round tower here, and these are you can see the 2 small little lines there where the cursor is, and she dug another one out in the field. But these two archaeology was found in these 2. The one closest to the round tower, which is the bottom left-hand corner, as you can see, found evidence for burials. Burials close to the round tower. Now, although this isn't correctly orientated, you'll see that north is running along the line of the trench, so the bodies are facing east-west, so they're most likely Christian. But at the far end of the trench, you can see that's the curve there of the round tower. So you can see how close the bodies were built, or the bodies were buried to the close to the round tower. The other archaeology that she found was in the second trench, is this trench here, and she found evidence for a possible ditch feature, which is interesting and will come into play further later in the talk. But while I have this slide, this is you can see this circle here. This is the circle of the current graveyard with the church in it. But again, that enclosure is some 30 meters in diameter, classically casual in size, and most likely had to have been a pre-existing early Christian enclosure, which was reused for religious purposes later on. Chris Lynn in 1980 also took, because there was some proposed work to be developed to the south of the church, he carried out an excavation on this field boundary here to see whether this was evidence of an enclosure associated with the monastic site. Inconclusive, but 60-40 in favor of it being an enclosure associated with the monastic site. So adding all of that together, you have the dotted line there. Sorry, my cursor seems to be disappearing and appearing on me, but the dotted line shows an extension of the information seen by Hamlin. She got the line of a possible ditch in one of her trenches here, and Chris Lynn got one of his a ditch down here in his 1980, and it coincides with the line of that curving field boundary. Now, the problem with that being an enclosure to do with the church is that the round tower is outside the line of the enclosure, which would make that very unusual. However, the eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that further to the north, we have another curving boundary running round, which is unusual, considering the straightness of all the other boundaries in the area. So keep an eye on that boundary, because that comes into play later on in the talk. So what other monastic enclosures we have? We have St. Mackay in Dundrum, probably one of probably the most famous ecclesiastical site, monastic site in Northern Ireland. 7th century, well, 5th century foundation, but referenced in the 7th century. It was burnt in 976, and then in the 12th century the Benedictines took it over. But what's quite interesting about it, bottom right-hand corner here, is the sort of size. You have the church and you have the round tower, but note that the round tower is firmly within the enclosure, which is unlike our projected line for our Maghera enclosure. But on the bottom left-hand side, then you have a reconstruction of what Dundrum might have looked like in its heyday, with a very prominent round tower and the church in association. But it's interesting that you have the inner. The monument is basically divided into 3. You have the core enclosure, the outer enclosure again, and then you have the third enclosure running right round the outside. And basically, the inner enclosure was the Holy of Holies. That's where the church was. That's where the saints' relics would be. And that's where the mass. And then you had the monks living in the next enclosure out. And then you have the people associated with the monastery living in the third one. And then you had lay people living on the outside. So that's a division there. This is Downpatrick. Again, Downpatrick, it's well known, and again, it's the subject of a talk coming up by my good self next week. But without giving too much away, basically, we know that we have enclosures because we have archaeological and geophysical evidence for it. And this is again, the reconstruction of Downpatrick in the bottom right-hand corner, again with the church and the very prominent round tower located in the core of the enclosure. I add this one in because I was doing some work in and around Bangor Abbey, and I noticed when I was looking at the early Ordnance Survey maps that you have the church, which is this group of buildings outlined in red in the core, and then you'll note that, and they exist today, the curving line of the road running around on the west side, outside which is another curving line picked up by old laneways, creating again, preserved in the modern landscape, these enclosures. So if we overlay Dundrum onto Maghera, this is what we get. And it's there's a surprisingly good fit, although you know, I'm wary enough about doing these wonderful overlays because they mean everything and they can mean nothing. But it's interesting that when you scale Dundrum down or up to the size of Maghera, you get a very good concordance with the general outline of the enclosure ditch and with the inner core. And I think that's really interesting, that little graphic there, because it does give an indication that we have, albeit this round tower, which is problematical lying outside, I'd much prefer to see that round tower preferably in the core, but nonetheless, it is what it is. But what I've done here is I've taken a series of other ecclesiastical enclosures, and this is where this again, this curving boundary in the top right-hand corner comes from. If we take this boundary to the south and that boundary to the north as potentially being the global enclosure, and we put in some famous Irish ecclesiastical enclosures on top of that, and you can see there's Kells, there's the Bangor one I talked to you about, there's Duleek, and then the Downpatrick one. Both the Bangor, the Kells, and the Duleek, which is ultimately a town, and Bangor itself, they are beginning to describe a circle that includes these modern features all the way around. So it is entirely possible that the ecclesiastical enclosure that we know as Maghera in its core is actually a very small part of the monument as we know it, and might originally have been a much further extension. The final slide I'm going to show you, and it's interesting, that's a first edition Ordnance Survey map, and then by the time we get to much further on, we have the development of the railway. It shouldn't be forgotten that the old railway line runs through very close to the line of the ecclesiastical enclosure. But however, it's just that it is also part of the archaeological landscape, albeit industrial archaeology. And I'm hoping that one of these days the Mourne and Down will see sense and turn that into a greenway, which would be a fantastic resource for both walkers and cyclists and whatever alike, bringing in all the archaeology of the Maghera area along a nice, easy walk. So that's it, Aidan. I'm done. Thank you very much. If there's any questions to all of that, by all means, I'd be delighted to answer them.